Very good. Oops. Test 1, 2, 3. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay.
It works. And we still have 5 minutes to go.
Yeah. 2:30, yes. And then we have a 3 o'clock business unusual.
Let me If I could ask you all to take your seats as quickly as possible, we're going to start very, very shortly. And a very good morning from the beautiful Palais de Congrès here in sunny and very, very warm Marrakesh, the city that's hosting our 2022 EBRD annual meeting and business forum. My name is Jonathan Charles. I'm the EBRD's Managing Director of Communications and Business Information Services. It's a great pleasure to be here moderating this panel today. The theme of our annual meeting captures the spirit of the moment. We're looking at the global challenges and how to respond to them in these turbulent times. And in order to respond, of course, we need to get a pretty good understanding of what we're dealing with. What are these crises and the challenges that come with them? This session aims to do just that by delving into our latest economic growth forecasts. Our focus, of course, this time is also on the big I, inflation, the return of runaway price increases. To discuss all of this, please welcome, both here in the room and if you're watching online, some of our brilliant array of economists, or array of brilliant economists, depending which way you want to have it. They are here with us in Marrakesh. First of all, Beata Javorcik, the EBRD Chief Economist and Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford. Next to me, Heike Harmgart is the Managing Director for the EBRD for the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean region, and was a former member of the Chief Economist's Office. She's a recovering economist, I suppose, in recovery. And Sergei Guriev in the middle there, Professor of Economics at SciencesPo in Paris, former EBRD Chief Economist. Before we begin, let me just set out a couple of housekeeping rules. The event is available in English and French. Our Interaxio app for the translations is available, and you can find the details on that. We'll also be taking your questions towards the end of our panel. So if you're not in the room here, you can raise your hand, by the way, if you're in the room. If you're not in the room, please submit them via logging on to slido.com, S-L-I-D-O, slido.com. You can use the code 917000. Regional Economic Prospects 2022 is the panel, and post your question there, and we'll try and find a few minutes at the end to actually answer this. But let's start with an overview of our growth across the EBRD regions. And Beata, you should start, I think, as the Chief Economist, really, by giving us what is the big picture? How are the EBRD regions being affected by the war on Ukraine?
So thank you, Jonathan. The war has interrupted the post-pandemic recovery and worsened the economic outlook for all but 2 countries of operations. In aggregate, if you look at the EBRD regions, now we are expecting growth to be 3 percentage points lower relatively to what we were anticipating in November. And note that this is based on relatively optimistic assumptions. We are assuming that the war would end sometime towards late summer, and that the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine would start towards the end of the year. If we take a more pessimistic view of there being gas supply interruptions, then we expect to see all the post-COVID recovery gains to be wiped out this year, and the GDP not coming back to the pre-pandemic level until towards the end of next year. And on the chart that's being drawn behind me, that's the dashed line scenario. Now, moving on to specific countries, we anticipate a decline in Ukrainian GDP at the order of 30%. Of course, it's very hard to make predictions during a wartime, but what we know is that military activities took place on the territory of Ukraine that was responsible for generating 60% of GDP pre-COVID. We know that between 1/3 and 1/2 of firms are not operating, and that usage of electricity, which tends to be a very good indicator for economic activity, is down by 40%. Now, as for Russia, we expect GDP decline of 10%. That's comparable to what Western Europe experienced at the height of the COVID pandemic. So that's quite a substantial recession. Thank you. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much indeed, Beata. I was just jotting down some of those figures you were trotting out, and maybe we should turn to you, Sergei. Minus 30% in Ukraine, minus 10% in Russia. How do you see the impact on growth in these 2 countries?
Thank you, Jonathan. Indeed, these are huge numbers. They are very different numbers, obviously. So Ukraine is suffering from deaths and exodus of many, many people. This is the worst refugee crisis since the end of the Second World War. If you look at Europe, if you look at European countries, the number of Ukrainians crossing border going to Europe is much higher than the number of Syrian and Iraqi refugees 7 years ago. The 30% estimate looks horrible, but that's not the worst estimate if you look at other international financial institutions. Some of them give 35% and some of them give 45%, in line with the 40% figure decline in electricity that Beata has mentioned. And in that sense, the situation is really horrible. So one of the things I've done in recent weeks, together with a couple of former chief economists of the IMF and two brilliant Ukrainian economists, Yuri Gorodnichenko and Timofey Milovanov, and 3 other Western economists, we put together a blueprint for reconstruction of Ukraine. So it's some kind of Marshall Plan for post-war Ukraine. And our estimates for destroyed production assets are in the range of $200 billion to $500 billion. And some of us, not me, but some of us believe the number is actually even bigger. So the reconstruction, if it starts in the fall, is going to be a very, very challenging task, and I hope EBRD, alongside with other institutions, will contribute. Russia is a completely different story. Russia is physically intact, but economically destroyed. And this is something that we've not seen in many, many years and actually decades. This is the worst recession in 30 years in Russia. And here EBRD's estimates are mid-range, in the sense that there are some international institutions and some government agencies in Russia are more optimistic, slightly more optimistic. Some are actually more pessimistic. Today there was a leak from Ministry of Finance reported by Bloomberg, which said minus 12% is the right number. And there is a think tank in Washington, D.C. called Institute for International Finance that makes a prediction of minus 15%. But even minus 10% is a huge recession. Now, it's not just the magnitude of the fall. Beata correctly mentioned that COVID was as painful in the Western Europe, like as minus 10%, but it was clear there will be a recovery right away. Here, we don't see any perspective for the recovery because the main impact of the sanctions is to disconnect Russia from the global economy. And that's the goal of the sanctions, to weaken Russian economy. And as long as this belligerent regime, this aggressive regime remains in place, we should expect sanctions to remain in place. And so a lot of Russian industry, a great part of Russian economy will remain disconnected. And so this minus 10% will not be followed by plus 10% recovery. And in that sense, it's a huge, huge impact, which will hit everybody. The oligarchs, the middle class, and the ordinary Russians will see decline in wealth and income. And again, the official estimates suggest that Russian households' real incomes will go down by 10%. So it's a huge, huge shock. And in that sense, unfortunately, it's hard to be optimistic regarding these two countries. Thank you, Jonathan.
Just very quickly, Sergei, before we move on, I mean, Russia has got a great track record over many, many recessions and painful economic moments of enduring economic pain. Therefore, it should be able to, presumably, it will soak up the punishment. I mean, that seems to be almost built into the way the Russian economy operates. Both people seem able to soak up the economic punishment. They've shown it in the past, you know, in the economy itself.
So in the duration of the last 20 years, Russia has gone through several economic shocks. The magnitude of those shocks was smaller. But also, there is a qualitative difference. For example, 2008, 2009, Russia had 20% of GDP sovereign wealth fund, which it used to compensate industries and households that were hit by the crisis. The same happened in 2014, 15, 16. This is not what's going to happen now because Russian reserves are frozen, sanctioned. And if oil and gas embargo comes in this year somehow, then Russia will have a major fiscal problem as well. Right now, Russia doesn't have still a fiscal problem because oil prices are so high, so money keeps coming in. But this will be a test that Russian economy and Russian households have not seen since late 80s, early 1990s. And I'm old enough to remember late 80s. That resulted in a disintegration of a major superpower which had much stronger military machine and much bigger propaganda and repression apparatus. And it actually had an ideology. So we'll see how this particular political system will weather this storm.
All right, thank you very much, Sergei. And of course, we'll be dissecting some of the things that you and Beata have just laid out there in greater detail in the minutes ahead. But let's turn to this region where we are now in this country. Heike, when you look at the forecast, you know, a lot of countries, Morocco, other countries in this region, they are looking at the return of inflation and some of the issues. So if we look at that, you know, how do you see the picture here?
No, thank you, Jonathan. And I think if you look at the graphs that are presented just behind us, you see a very similar picture for the southern and eastern Mediterranean in terms of the trends. But I just want to take you back a little bit. This is a region that actually dealt with the COVID pandemic quite well. For example, we are here in sunny, hot Morocco. Morocco has the highest vaccination rates across Africa. They have really managed to have a fast bounce back, over 7.4% growth last year after the recession. The government did a lot in supporting economic growth and recovery, and that is the case basically across all of the southern and eastern Mediterranean countries, with maybe the exception of Lebanon, that is a case in its own point and has its own political dimension. But so you see actually countries coming out of the recovery from the pandemic quite well, but also having used up a lot of their own international and national reserves, and having started programs with international organizations, with the IMF, that help them stabilize. But they are more vulnerable now than before the pandemic. And so we see the impact of the war on Ukraine less direct, of course, than on these countries, but indirect impact will be massive. In particular, I think the game that everyone is talking about is around food price inflation, and we'll have more time to talk about it later. But all of the countries in the southern and eastern Mediterranean are grain and wheat importers. Russia and Ukraine are massive grain and wheat exporters globally. And so this is a very direct impact that will impact inflation, food price inflation. Also, all of the countries in this region are importing fertilizers. Again, something that is exported also through Russia and Ukraine. So a secondary impact on fertilizers. And then you mentioned that we're in a sunny place, but unfortunately for Morocco, the sunshine this year is the worst drought since the 80s. So also there's some additional shocks on food prices that are regional that will have an impact. So I think we will see huge increases in food price inflation, in energy price inflation in this region, with governments that have less scope, less room to react. I guess in a way, from an EBRD perspective, it makes us more useful and more helpful, but I think huge task also from a secondary perspective from these regions to tackle, and I think an important moment to see how we can help them, both the governments and the private sector, to make a difference there.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Heike. I think, you know, just from the headlines we've heard, and we have heard the headlines, you know, we're clearly in a fairly major economic crisis, you know, which is arriving, and we'll get deeper. Let's go, I think, below the surface of some of these issues. Beata, you know, a big part of what's driving some of this crisis will be rising prices, inflation. Commodity prices are particularly going to be a part of this, aren't they?
Absolutely. Commodity markets are one of the pressure points. Russia and Ukraine are, for instance, important exporters of metals, aluminum, used for aluminum cans, nickel, crucial for batteries. And actually supplies of nickel were already low before the war, and nickel being linked to oligarchs already saw prices, the market's pricing those linkages in. Palladium, which is needed for catalytic converters in combustion engine cars. And of course, many metals which are needed for the renewable energy sector, so chromium, lithium, and so on. And of course, if you look at Belarus and Russia, the two countries export a lot of inputs that are needed to produce fertilizers. So that's potash and ammonia. That has sent fertilizer prices very high globally and is affecting farmers all over the world, from India to the US. So even if the war stopped today, the fact that fertilizer prices are high globally will mean that in many countries less fertilizers will be used and harvest is going to be lower, keeping commodity prices, food prices high well into the next year.
All right, so it's pretty painful. Let's take another look at price rises and where they're coming from. Sergei, gas prices, I mean, it's leaking into everything, isn't it? As gas prices, as fuel prices rise, that has an impact on absolutely everything. What does that mean for Russia's economy, and how reliant are we all on Russian gas, for example?
Right, so this chart was actually very informative in the sense that it was showing that gas prices quadrupled since the beginning of the war, and this is something that started already before the war, when some people in Europe would suggest that Gazprom, the Russian state company which controls exports of gas from Russia, was abusing its market power. And the European Commission was even talking about launching an investigation. Now, the war has probably delayed certain things and derailed certain things, but it definitely increased gas prices. So for Russia as an economy and for Russian budget as a fiscal entity, oil is much more important than gas, in the sense that the revenues from oil exports last year were 3 times as important as gas exports. Another thing, which is also something that you need to bear in mind, is gas can be transported by pipelines or boats, liquefied natural gas. And for Russia, most of the gas is transported by pipelines. So there are pipelines going to China, there are also pipelines going to Europe. So if you look at the exports of gas in Russia and production of gas in Russia, LNG, liquefied natural gas, is 10 times as small as pipeline gas. Why I'm saying that is because Europe depends on Russian gas. About a third of European gas imports come from Russia, and in some countries much more, in some countries 100% actually. But for Russia, those exports are also important. Switching off exports to big countries like Germany or Italy would mean that Russia will have to burn this gas or leave it in the ground. And one of the things I would say is, yes, Germany and Italy are very dependent, and some other countries closer to Russia actually are also very dependent on Russian gas, but Russia is also dependent on this cash. And one of the examples I would give is, for better or worse, President Putin at some point said, I will only accept rubles when you want to buy Russian gas. And G7 said, sorry, contracts are in dollars and euros, and we'll pay in dollars and euros. Russia said, if you don't pay in rubles, we'll switch it off. But they didn't. They said, we'll create a special scheme with Gazprom Bank where you actually pay in dollars and euros, but then we convert it into rubles ourselves. And that was an example where Europe called Russia's bluff. Now, the other thing is, switching off Russian oil and gas completely would be very painful for Europe. But these costs are not catastrophic. So if oil and gas embargo is introduced tomorrow by Europe, there'll be a recession. But this will not be a recession that is comparable to the COVID recession. So there are various estimates. And for example, for Euro area on average, we are talking about 1 or 2% of GDP fall if oil and gas are not imported from Russia. In countries like Germany, we are talking probably about 3%. So some estimates give you 6, but there are also the debate in the economic profession suggests that 3% is more of a credible number. But this is a cost, but as former president of ECB, now Prime Minister Draghi, has said, you need to choose between peace and air conditioning. Here in Morocco, air conditioning is a must. But what Prime Minister Draghi wanted to say, he said, it's hard to live without air conditioning, so it will be a cost if you choose peace. But it's possible to live without air conditioning, so this cost is not catastrophic. And in that sense, I'm very happy to see that this discussion is progressing. Some European countries, such as Hungary, try to block introduction of oil and gas embargo or oil and gas tariffs on Russian oil and gas, but it will happen simply because without that, to keep financing this war.
very price of principle. Actually, not for today, but it is a discussion, I think, to be had, how high a price are countries willing to pay for principle. At the moment, it seems as though they are willing to pay that price. Just, Sergei, just one quick thing to pick up. You talked about the pipelines flowing west for Russia. What about the markets to the east, and how are they going to serve those? You know, so we do hear often, you know, that Russian gas would be in greater demand in China or in India, for example.
Right. So again, here we need to separate oil and gas. So oil is reasonably easy to divert. You put oil on boats. This is also not straightforward because there will be transportation embargo. There will be secondary sanctions on whoever helps to transport Russian oil. There will be an insurance embargo. You will not be able to insure Russian oil tankers easily. But regarding gas, as I said, LNG capacity is limited, very small, and pipelines are full. So you need to build new pipelines. It's going to take time. It's not impossible. It will probably be done. I would remind you that the main pipeline going east was built exactly after 2014, modestly called Power of Siberia. But this pipeline is full. And so you need a new pipeline if you want to sell more gas to the east. And in that sense, as I said, one of the proposals, for example, today on the table is not to stop buying Russian gas, but impose a high tax on Russian gas. So instead of having this jump here, Russia doesn't get as much money. So Russia gets half or 1/3 or 1/4 of this jump in gas prices. And Russia will still keep exporting. Why? Because otherwise it just has to burn this gas, nowhere to put it, in the short run at least, which will mean that this year Russia will keep selling gas at pre-war prices or pre-2021 prices, which means much less money for Russia to pay its soldiers and officers and mercenaries in Ukraine.
I just want to move on to Beata and say, but I don't quite understand that argument about tax, actually. Maybe you need to unpack it a bit. I've heard it obviously mentioned a few times. But what's to stop Russia saying, well, look, this is the market price for the gas, which we know is high, and then the tax having to be levied even on top of the high market price? Why does it reduce or keep still the market price of gas to divert it, some of it into taxation? Why doesn't it just add to the overall cost of gas?
Well, the answer to this question is, well, maybe there will be some price increase, and there are various estimates that there will be some price increase and therefore decline in consumption of Russian gas. But as I said, Russia has no alternative use of this pipeline gas going to Europe. So in the long run, Russia will build another pipeline and say to Europeans, thank you very much, we will sell this gas to somebody else. But by now, there is no choice. And in that sense, that may actually work. There are more interesting proposals such as price cap. There is less market-based in a sense. So Mario Draghi is suggesting price cap for Russian oil and gas, where Europe just says, we are going to buy your gas at this price and we'll pay you nothing more. The tax proposal is somewhat better because you can use part of this money. You can actually store it temporarily in escrow accounts and say, we are not going to give this money to Western governments. We'll keep this money for reconstruction of Ukraine, for example. In case, which is very likely, Russia is obliged to pay reparations to Ukraine, this is the amount which is sitting there in escrow accounts which will be used. And so these are the discussions which are happening now, lots of various mechanisms. But I think regarding gas, this is a very important thing to bear in mind. Russia doesn't have an alternative buyer of this particular gas. There is no other pipeline. And so I gave this example with Gazprombank and paying in rubles, suggesting that if you call Russia's bluff, it doesn't really have to do, cannot do much. There was a switching off of Poland and Bulgaria, but these are unfortunately or fortunately not big countries in terms of buying Russian gas.
Poland doesn't need air conditioning.
Exactly. But switching off Germany and Italy is not likely. If Russia wants, Russia is not likely to switch off Germany and Italy.
Okay. Beata, let's stick with gas prices. I mean, as we've noted, even before the war, prices were rising anyway. And there was probably an inevitability about that, wasn't there? Because economic production was ramping up, economies coming back to full life after COVID. All these things would have meant price rises anyway in gas.
Indeed. However, on top of that, we entered this autumn with storage tanks in Europe filled at the level that was lowest in a decade. So with a hindsight, it seems obvious that Russia was blocking supplies of gas in preparation for the war. Just to appreciate the scale of the issue, if Europe does not buy Russian gas, LNG is an alternative, and Europe has greatly increased its imports of LNG. However, globally, the supply of liquefied natural gas is limited by infrastructure. Just as an example, the US promised to sell Europe 15 billion cubic meters of LNG this year. That's about 10% of what Europe purchases from Russia every year. So in the short run, increasing purchases, increasing imports of LNG from alternative places will be difficult. I think it's also interesting to look at what's happening in oil markets. Unlike gas markets, oil markets are global, and however, right now you see a divergence between the price of Brent and price of Urals. Urals being the type of oil that is sold by Russia. That oil is heavier, it has a higher sulfur content, and that means that if Europe does not want to purchase gas from Russia, oil from Russia, it either needs to buy similar type of crude, so for instance from Saudis or the United Arab Emirates, or you need to actually invest into changing your refinery so that it would be able to process another kind of crude. Now, this divergence between the price of Brent and Urals is already reflecting the fact that many Western oil concerns, for reputational reason, due to pressure from their shareholders, from the public, do not buy Russian oil in spot markets. They are still bound by long-term contracts, and unless there is a formal embargo, they cannot get out of these long-term contracts without incurring high financial costs. But the fact that they are shunning spot markets is already causing divergence. There are reports of some smaller Chinese refineries purchasing Russian oil, but at the moment it seems that state-owned entities are not increasing their purchases of Russian crude, and that's presumably out of fear of secondary sanctions.
And we've been examining, Beata, various aspects now of price rises. We've talked about oil and gas. We've talked about commodity price rises. Many of these things are also feeding into food prices, and we're seeing an increase in those. We've all seen it even in our own economies. What do you think is the real danger of a growing food price rise movement? I mean, it's got a momentum, hasn't it? This does now see, built in almost when you talk to many markets, 20-25% increases in some food prices.
So there are several dangers. Now, emerging markets are hit particularly high by food prices, as you see on this chart. In countries such as Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan, food prices account for more than a third of a consumption basket. This is the CPI basket that's supposed to reflect consumption patterns of households. And moreover, typically poorer households spend more on necessities. So it's not only emerging markets that are hit harder, it's also the poorer households. That means that unless some action is taken by government, we may see political instability. And indeed, in 2008, when we saw spikes in food prices, there were riots in 40 countries. So this puts policymakers in front of a very unattractive trade-off of subsidizing food prices in a situation where their government finances are already strained by COVID, and when interest rates are rising and servicing public debt becomes more expensive.
Heike, let's turn to you again. You know, here we are in this region, the southern and eastern Mediterranean. Food prices are always a sensitive issue in many of the economies here. How big are the worries, do you think, around food security and around these price rises?
I think the worries are very big in this region, and I mean this chart, and as the countries that Beata was highlighting are exactly countries in this region that score the highest in terms of food price inflation: Morocco, Egypt. And if you all remember the Arab Spring, I mean, part of it was triggered by rising food prices in both Tunisia, but then also in Egypt. So there's a history of rising food prices triggering discontent among the population. And as you see, it's mostly, of course, the poorer households that struggle. You could see the first instances of this trade-off and how governments chose what to do in the last months of Ramadan, which we just came out of, where actually governments were very worried about the bread consumption, bread prices, and most governments across the southern and eastern Mediterranean, even those who had liberalized food subsidies, decided to have food subsidies again for the months of Ramadan in order to stabilize the economy and stabilize food inflation. So I think governments are very worried, and governments are in this very difficult trade-off that their finances have been depleted. They have really injected a lot of liquidity into the COVID recovery and are now struggling to do the same to moderate food price inflation. Maybe also one comment: most of the food import in the southern eastern Mediterranean is done by governments. So there is a lot of control on the one hand, but there's also a lot less flexibility in terms of diversifying the food imports, diversifying via the private sector. So the governments struggle, and I think there's a lot of political awareness, and that's why we're seeing a lot of governments that may have not talked to the IMF in many, many years are now starting to talk to the IMF to help with long-term cheap finances, to help them stabilize food import, to invest in food storage, grain storage in particular, infrastructure, and to reduce food losses along the value chain. Unfortunately, what we're seeing, these are often medium-term measures to really short-term crises and impact. So I think we're going to see a really challenging and volatile 6 months in this region, unfortunately.
So I think we're building up a picture here, aren't we? It's in the regional economic prospects, but generally we're building up a picture that there is quite a storm. It's partially here. It's certainly coming. And I guess I'd like to get a view from all three of you on, give us some context as to how big an inflation crisis you think this is going to be. I'm old enough, I can remember the inflation crisis quite well of the 70s. And again again after the Iran oil shock, actually, in the early 80s, and again in the early 90s, after the German unification impact shock in Europe. So I can see many, many different sort of elements in my past of inflation, but give us an idea of how you would compare what we're about to go through to perhaps what we've seen in recent economic history. Beata.
So let's start with the causes for inflation. During the first stage of recovery, inflation was driven by this mismatch between supply of goods and demand, as consumers were shifting their preferences towards consuming more manufactured goods and less of services. Then in the summer, we saw red-hot labor markets in Central Europe. So there was inflationary pressure coming from labor markets. Then the war hit, sending commodity prices sky high. And now on top of that, we have pressure on emerging market currencies as some capital is flowing out as there is return to safety. So that exacerbates inflationary pressures in countries that import commodities. Now, in emerging markets, the danger of inflationary expectations being detached from the central bank's target is particularly great. We know from academic research that people form their inflationary expectations based on their cumulative lifetime experience. So if Sergei and I are old enough to have experienced hyperinflation of the 1990s, that memory will stay with us forever, and we are much quicker when it comes to expecting higher inflation. Also, the fact that agricultural commodities have been hit, means that inflationary expectations may be increased, and that's because people tend to assess inflation based on their most frequent purchases. And groceries are what people buy frequently. So if they see food prices going up, they would expect higher inflation than what the real overall level of inflation in the economy is. Interestingly, women tend to expect higher inflation than men do.
Quick gender aspect to the inflation argument. Sergei, how do you see the magnitude of what we're about to face?
Right. As Leo Tolstoy said, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So if you look around the world, the sources of inflation are different. In the United States, there are issues that Beata has mentioned, the mismatch between the support for the economy, the stimulus that was extremely generous, much more generous than in Europe in particular, and the limitations of supply, in some cases driven by, for example, zero COVID policies in China, which undermined the global economy, providing the supply that could have happened. And the structure of stimulus could also have resulted in dislocation of labor market. COVID itself has changed the structure of the labor market. So these things might have been temporary, but by now we have so many temporary shocks that, as again in transition economies they would say, and the word transition is temporary, right? But the very fact that this institution, EBRD, exists 30 years later tells you that there is nothing more temporary, no more permanent than temporary. So the accumulation of temporary shocks may have contributed to something which we now perceive as a big, big inflation problem. Now I would say that, for example, in a country like Turkey, inflation was very high already before the war and even before COVID. Now it's higher than pre-COVID, but still, there are certain things which are driven by monetary policy mistakes. And here, where I would say that I won't be too scared relative to 1970s. So when you open the macroeconomic textbooks these days, the first lesson they give you is Great Depression of 1930s. The second, the Great Stagflation of 1970s. So if you look at the graphs, the graphs a couple of slides ago, you would see that the increase in gas prices today is higher than the one in 1970s. And yet we talk about inflation as a problem, not as an existential crisis. Why? First, economies have become much more resilient since 1970s, even to shocks like this. Second, central bankers have learned a lot. And a lot of people now criticize Federal Reserve for being slow to respond to inflation last year. But we are talking about Federal Reserve being slow by half a year, not by a decade like it would be in the 20th century. And in that sense, I'm actually less pessimistic. But the story about the war, the oil price shock, and the grain price shock, that's very real, and I'm really, really worried about this, and for the reasons we just discussed. I would just say that there is a report on this region, on the firm-based data. It's EBRD, World Bank, European Investment Bank together surveyed firms before COVID and during COVID, and this report is coming up in June. It's all done before the war, so the war-related problems are not there. But in this report, there'll be a lot more problems than just inflation, war, and even COVID. And so it pains me to talk about those issues that, in addition to all the issues related to access to finance, the human capital challenges, you also have this additional problems that shouldn't have been here in the first place.
Thank you, Sergei. By the way, 31 years of the EBRD is temporary in the whole span of human history. I think it's the thousands and thousands of years. Heike, how do you see this?
I unfortunately have to say, indeed, all these external shocks that have been compounding on top of each other are really hitting these regions with a limited scope to react to it. And I think I want to also highlight both the elements that Sergei and Beata said around food security. So And I reiterate, so we're just coming out of the months of Ramadan, and I don't know anyone who's ever experienced Ramadan, the talk is all about food. I mean, what you do all day during Ramadan is talking about food, and you're looking forward to the 2 meals, the iftar and suhoor that you have. You're wondering what you're going to cook. You're looking at what, and so everyone, at least for the last months in this region, has looked at food prices every day, because this is the month where families come together, friends come together, and everyone has exact expectations. And I think there were years when people would just speak about meat increases, lamb increases during Ramadan, and that was like a big shock and people were becoming worried. But this year was the first year in a long time that people were talking about bread, that people were talking about vegetables, people were talking about domestically produced ingredients for Ramadan. And I think that is actually a sign that expectations on food price inflations are enormous in this region, that food price inflation makes a huge part of the basket, and that people are worried that governments don't have the solution, that the private sector doesn't have the solution, and importing the basic food largely from across the world is actually maybe a problem. And solutions to diversify, to have more private sector, to increase efficiency may come too late for this year. So coming out of this month where we all ate too much after sunset, I feel this is really a big worry for this region, and this region is really seeking not just long-term solution, but also something that can happen in the medium term, where a lot of these external shocks, on top of what Sergei was saying, the internal problems that get exacerbated, are hitting countries at a moment where they have really limited ways to react.
Thank you, Heike. We've only got a couple of minutes before we go to some audience questions, but Beata, before that, I just want to ask you a quick question. You know, we've had 2 major crises in quick succession, COVID-19 pandemic, now the war on Ukraine. Where does that leave the fiscal vulnerability of EBRD economies?
As you said, countries are not in a very comfortable situation worldwide, because all countries are entering this year with increased public debt. And the fact that globally we have seen interest rates increasing is exacerbating this pressure, because it's increasing the cost of servicing the debt. And as you see on this chart, many countries in this region, from Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, they are all facing quite high costs of servicing government debt. In Egypt, this cost runs above 8% of GDP. In the other 2 countries, it's 4% of GDP. And this is a substantial outflow. And as inflation at the moment is not going away, and as we are likely to see further increases in interest rates in the US and in other advanced economies, that means that the situation will only be exacerbated.
All right, thank you very much, Beata. All right, let's take some audience questions. If you've got a question here in the audience, you can put your hand up, by the way, and we'll bring you a microphone. But let's start with some of our remote viewers who've been putting their questions on slido.com. Let's take one from Dr. Abdelila Shami, who says, can we talk about an economic recession or just a growth slowdown for the countries of the European Union, and what domino effect on regions in North Africa as well of that? So, I don't know, Beata, why don't you start with that? Are we talking about recession or growth slowdown? I suppose the answer is first one, then the other, maybe.
Well, it depends how long the war will continue, right? A technical definition of a recession is right, 2 quarters of negative growth. I don't think we are there yet, but there is a real possibility that there will be a recession. And as the person asking the question rightly points out, even a slowdown in Europe will be felt in the broadly defined European neighborhood. It will be felt in Eastern Europe. It will be felt in Morocco, which has quite substantial exports to the European Union. If there was, one bright light during the COVID pandemic for Eastern Europe, it was the huge demand for manufactured products from Germany and other Eurozone countries. Transition countries tend to have higher industrial sector than countries with comparable level of incomes. And this dependence on manufacturing has served them well as the world started demanding more goods rather than services.
Heike, when you look at North Africa and the countries that you deal with in the SEMED region generally, how are they viewing it? Do they expect recession or growth slowdown?
I think they are hoping for a growth slowdown, and I think the pessimists may expect a recession, but I think they are also looking outside of their own countries in order to determine what is it going to be. And I think maybe to highlight, for Morocco, Morocco has been incredibly successful in integrating in the automotive value chain, aeronautics with Europe, and so they are incredibly dependent on growth in Europe for their industrial production. And then an area that we haven't really talked about, but it's dear to my heart and it's really dear to the Moroccans and all the countries in the North African and southern Eastern Mediterranean region, is renewable energy. These countries have been really on a growth path of harvesting the sun, the wind, and have increased their share. Morocco has been one of the most ambitious in terms of their renewable energy targets, and now they're missing ingredients as sort of Beata had lithium for the battery, for storage, but also parts for the solar value chain, the wind value chain. So I think all of this, it's not for these countries alone to decide, but looking at how are these value chains for increased renewable energy production with Europe, how are they developing, and this will unfortunately determine whether it's just a growth slowdown or whether also these countries will look at a recession maybe 6 to 8 to 9 months down the line.
Right, yes, because there is a time lag, of course, isn't there? Right, a question from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Maybe it's one for you, Sergei. What are your inflation expectations for Russia? We talked about growth taking a hit, but we haven't yet talked about inflation in Russia.
So this is a very difficult question because many things will change in the coming months, one direction or the other. The current official estimate is from 18 to 23% for year 2022. That sounds reasonable, and I think international financial institutions are in the same range. Again, much depends on when you make this forecast. Now, the new sanctions, which will be introduced for sure, may undermine Russian central bank's capacity to bring inflation down. But by now, the inflation fears are subsiding, and not just because Russian government talks about this, but because we can see that the Russian central bank reduces the interest rate even faster than the market thought. And so the most recent reduction was from 17% to 14%, even though the market priced in 15%. And in that sense, you see that the central bank sees the initial shock be subsiding. So just to give you a magnitude, so people talk about inflation being too high in Euro area or United States being 7 or 8% per year. In Russia, the first week after the war has started, inflation was 2% per week. The second week, again, 2% per week. The third week, again, 2% per week. Then it subsided to 1% per week, and now to kind of 20% per year levels. But overall, that's been a big inflationary shock, financial panic, panic buying of things. So if you don't know if ruble is worth anything and you're not allowed to buy dollars, what do you buy? If you're middle class, you may want to buy a car. If you are a poor person, you buy sugar, or you buy a supply of drugs for the next few months because you're not sure if medical products will be available. And you buy buckwheat, which is the durable good of choice in Russia. And so this panic buying brought prices up, but by now inflation has subsided. I think 20% is a reasonable estimate.
Thank you. Okay, before we take some more questions on slides, is there anybody here who'd like to ask a question in the room in Marrakesh? And then, okay, a few people. We'll try and get through them quite quickly. I don't know whether we've got a microphone that we can bring up here. Hopefully we have. Yes, we have. Okay, let's start with Ben Aris, who's sitting on my right-hand side, just here.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ben Aris from BNE and Tele News. Question... Sorry. I look in the camera. Hello. Question in 3 parts. The oil sanctions. As we watch what's going on in Brussels, that's going to take some time. that as everyone said on the panel, they can't be put into place quickly. And if you look at Hungary and Slovakia, Bulgaria are actually talking about 2023. So in that sense, the oil sanctions, the money that Russia's making from that money to fund the war, and given I think the general assumption is this war is going to go on in terms of months, not years, that we're not going to be able to cut off the Kremlin's money in order to stop the war machine. Is that the case? Secondly, the sanctions being imposed, they're going to severely affect the economy. Before, the growth potential of Russia was only 2%, so it was already growing well under par, but surely this new regime is so tough, it's going to reduce income from oil exports, gas exports, etc. What do you think the growth potential is now for Russia? Is it something on the order of 1%? And finally, the sanctions themselves are largely West versus Russia, G7 plus a few countries. And if you look at the UN voting, that in Asia, a lot of people were sitting on the fence. Here in Africa too, at least half the countries were either abstaining or even voted for Russia, particularly in the Human Rights Council. To the extent that these sanctions are leaky and that Russia is now going to turn towards Asia, has already done oil deals with India and China, of course. To what extent are these sanctions going to fail or at least be limited by the leaks? And what does this mean for globalization as well? Because I think one of the panelists mentioned that ships are going to be hit with secondary sanctions. So suddenly globalization, international freight transport of oil has become politicized. Doesn't this fundamentally change the way the world works? Isn't globalization not killed, but at least taken a hit? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ben. We will give brief answers to those lengthy questions. Just on maybe growth paths, first of all, but we'll wrap it all in one. And then the question of leaky sanctions. I expect Sergei's got something thoughtful on leaky sanctions. I might spare Beata on that issue. But Beata, growth paths.
So, ever since annexation of Crimea, Russia has prioritized macroeconomic stability over growth. And the real cost of sanction is not the minus 10% we see this year, it's the long-term cost. It's the cost of not importing knowledge and technology embodied in capital goods. It's the cost of multinationals not bringing their innovation, their marketing techniques. It's the cost of there being fewer exchanges between scientists and students. So the real cost is on the long-term growth potential. It's on this knowledge that is not flowing to Russia, is the human capital, the tens of thousands of Russians who are leaving the country. Many of them are in Georgia. And it is Russians who are abroad who will not be going back to the country. That's the real cost. On sanctions, I think some indication of the pressure on Russia is reflected in this divergence between the price of Brent and Urals, because if other countries want to purchase Russian oil, seeing the divergence, they will want a discount. Now, Russian budget balances at $44 a barrel, but as we were discussing this morning with Sergei, that assumes a certain amount of tax revenues which not be at expected level right now. Well, perhaps I should let Sergei say more about leaky sanctions.
Sergei.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with Beata. I think that there are certain things in today's global division of labor that prioritizes advanced economies as trade partners. So Russia needs Western technology, Western intermediate parts, not just because the West is closer, but because certain things are done better in the West, cannot be replaced by Chinese or African technology. This is the reality which we face right now. Russia can get a lot of cash, and Ben, I fully agree with you, without oil and gas sanctions, Russia will have a lot of cash, but it will not be able to produce new modern tanks, rockets, and jets because it needs Western technology, and even China cannot replace that. And in that sense, even leaky sanctions will not help Russia to continue this war as brutally as it started. And in that sense, this war may come to a halt when Russia runs out not just of modern tanks, but also Soviet-time tanks. I'm not kidding now, right now. I'm not a military expert. Last year I was not a COVID expert. This year I'm not a military expert. But I would just say that military experts say that you can observe Russia transporting towards the war zone the Soviet time equipment. So Russia is running out of modern stuff, and modern stuff cannot be produced without Western technology. It's not just the sailing oil to India at a 30% discount. And one thing I would just mention about globalization, this experience, like COVID, this experience shows how much globalization matters. If you are disconnected from the global economy, see what happens to you. This is an example of Russia today. Same in some cases we saw that during COVID, when borders were closed, we suddenly discovered that we depend on cross-border trade. But Russia is such a crystallized example of how globalization benefits you and how you suffer without globalization, that I think that whole story will help us think better about globalization.
Okay, very good point. We need a microphone here in the front for a gentleman to ask a question. If we can bring that up very, very swiftly. And it will have to be a very quick question, and we'll give you a very quick answer because we only have about 2 or 3 minutes.
Hello, Sergei from Lazard. Let me, Jonathan, disobey slightly. 2 very quick questions.
Very quick
First one is for Sergei. It's pretty stunning to see the difference of the estimate on impact of gas stoppage on Germany between what the academic community is producing, which is, I think, converging toward 3%, versus the more official estimates, which range from 10, and I read, I think yesterday, 15% GDP drop by a, I don't know if he's a named or unnamed.
Very quick. I'll have to hurry you up.
So is it just kind of, is it a different model, or is it just a different perspective? And for Beata, on grain, which has global importance. I mean, so it happened we had worked in Ukraine, and so contacts with CEOs of agri companies would indicate that actually work on the next campaign is going on. Fuel is a problem, but according to very non-scientific information I get, it's running at about 70%. And as President Zelensky this morning mentioned, the issue is to be able to take the grain out.
Okay,
so
we get the questions. Right, okay, thank you. Very quick answers. We've got about 90 seconds left. Sergei first, then Beata.
So the very quick answer is academic estimates are correct. The other estimates are wrong. And there is a great consensus among German economists that academic estimates are correct. And the reason is German government talks to their business friends who tell them, my factory will suffer badly. But of course, one single factory can suffer, but the business will be relocated to new industries. And so the economy as a whole will not suffer as badly as one single factory of one single lobbyist. And of course, there is also an incentive for German elites not to recognize the irresponsible energy policy choices that they've made in recent years. That's not what I'm saying. This is what German academics are saying. They're saying, you criticize Greece for irresponsible fiscal policy. Now you need to accept some blame for irresponsible energy policy.
Okay, Beata, very quickly, grain. The sowing season is underway in Ukraine.
It's underway, though it's worth keeping in mind that where military activity is taking place, that's the primary region where wheat is being grown. But even a 70% decline in harvest, planting happening at 70% of where it should be, that will shave off a few percentage points from the global supply of grain. And the question of getting the grain out, right? If you look at exports of corn by Ukraine, they were exclusively going via the Black Sea. So rail links are what remains, but of course we don't know whether they will be intact, whether the infrastructure will be intact at this point next year. So I can only agree with you that the situation, we are not out of the woods yet when it comes to grain prices, and remember fertilizer angle that affects harvest globally.
Thank you, Beata. Thank you, Sergei. Thank you, Heike. Thank you to all of you as well. Our latest economic forecasts are available on our website, ebrd.com. You'll find them there. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe to our podcast, Fearonomics. You'll hear Beata, Sergei, and I talking about all these issues and more. You can download it on iTunes. Reviewing and rating it will help others to find it. But from all of us, goodbye and thank you.